Come and journal with me as I am inspired by the creatures that lurk in the undergrowth and that are a little bit underappreciated. I'm going to use image transfer, collage, stencils, bit of stamping, watercolour and hand lettering. Hello, my name's Liz Chatterton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire and I have been art journaling for the last 6 months. I've got to the end of it and I'm going to do the last spread, and I want to show you how I went about doing it and all the different techniques that I threw at the pages. Earlier in the week I did these little sample squares in my journal. I spent a very happy morning with a friend showing her how to do sort of mixed media samples, and I was exploring the colour orange. And this one, if you can see it, I really liked. It's got a little snail on that I just put as a focal point, and it doesn't show up enough, but I was quite inspired by this colour palette and thought that it might be fun to do a whole journal spread based around this sort of burnt orange, bronze, goldy sort of colour with a snail. So I've found a lovely illustration that I want to do as an image transfer, and that's what I'm going to do. Actually, ever since I did those little squares, I've had the sort of childhood hymn of all things bright and beautiful going round and round in my head. And of course, one of the lines in that is all creatures great and small. So I thought this snail would just be great fun. If I'm going to do an image transfer, it will come out facing that way. So I think this snail is going to sort of go here. I'll use the colours and some of the techniques that I explored in those little squares and then go from there. So earlier in the week, I was trying to show my friend that you don't need anything posh to do art journaling. And these are some of the things I used. So a very old dictionary that the binding has gone from. And I might see if I can find snail in here. Got a bit of wallpaper, bit of packing paper. I think that's probably from a delivery. This is origami paper that I have got and is the only sort of purchase paper, but you could use a bit of wrapping paper, an illustration from a magazine, something to add a bit of pop of colour, a bit of brown packing paper, a bit of sheet music. I wouldn't really need more than that. If you want to be a bit more fancy, you could find maybe a napkin, and I did really like this because it was so bright and cheerful. If you're using a napkin, you just need to peel off the plain back and you only need the printed top. One thing about that is that it is then pretty transparent, so I might use that. I'm going to start with a layer of collage. I'm going to do my image transfer of my lovely snail. That's just from Pixabay, which is a royalty-free photo site. So that's going to go here. So I'm going to keep quite a clear space here. Then I'm going to do some texture, some writing, and put some finishing touches on. And the thing to do is just to get stuck in. It's quite intimidating to have a totally blank page. But do you know, if you just rip up a few things and get going, that soon disappears. And what we want to do is to make sure all the pieces of paper are different sizes and different shapes to give lots of visual interest. Simply ripping things because I think a ripped edge is a lot more attractive than a cut edge. I also like this packing paper because again, when you stick it down, it becomes slightly transparent. A lot of DIY shops have just got loads and loads of wallpaper samples available, and they make the very fatal mistake of saying, help yourself to a sample. So I do. Which means I usually go out with acres of the stuff, but hey, they said it. I'm trying to work very intuitively. As I say, I know that's just going to be my clear space there. I'm not overthinking this at the moment. You do not have to cover the whole of the paper. So what I do is just roughly rip things out to make sure that you have got a variety of sizes of papers and patterns, and that it's not too busy, and do a sort of rough organisation, and now do a more refined version of this. I've still got pieces to the side, so if I want to use them, they're close at hand. When you're pretty happy with your composition, it's time to do the sticking, and I like to use matte gel medium as my glue. You could use white glue, like school glue, Elmer's glue, that sort of stuff. You could use a glue stick, but that's rather a lot for a glue stick. So I would definitely use liquid glue. And I like matte gel medium simply because it's archival, so it won't yellow with time. It's great for going on top as well as a glue, so it seals it as well as sticks it. In the UK, Pabio is easy to get hold of and it's very economical. That's hard in the US, so I would look for maybe one of the golden matte gels, something like that. I would urge you to take a photo before you start sticking, because we're going to have to move all this off so we can stick it down, and it's really easy to forget your composition here. Now, as you stick it down, of course, you can change your mind. My top sticking hint is always put the glue on the heaviest paper. So in this case, that the base paper is nice and heavy, I'll put the glue there. Be really careful with things like packing paper, tissue paper, or napkins, because they're very fragile. The moment they get wet, they will just turn into mushy old papier-mâché. Be generous with your glue, because this is the foundation of your entire piece. And if it all falls together to pieces because you haven't stuck down the edges properly or whatever, you are going to cry. It's transparent, so don't worry one bit about putting it over the top of your papers as well as underneath. The other thing is that we are going to use in a moment some gesso on top of this, and that will calm down anything that is too busy. Don't worry about these overhangs, because when it's dry, it's really easy to either cut or rip off anything that's hanging over the edges of the paper. I've stuck all those pieces of paper down, and I know I'm going to have my snail transfer here, and I think my writing will probably go there. So this blank area doesn't worry me. I need to calm this area down because I want that snail to really show up. That's what I learned from my little test piece. So what I will do next, and I can do that before all this glue dries, is to apply some gesso. Let me carefully go back to my samples, and the gesso is some of the white here, and I used it to fade some of the background. You can also use the gesso to fade off any cut edges that you think are a little too sharp. So that might be a bit sharp. I need to fade this here, and I might just put a little bit of white gesso. Gesso, if you don't know what it is primer. And it's what you'd usually put on canvases so that the paint really grips to it. It's not fully opaque. You can get it white, clear and black, and it's incredibly useful. It will seal our papers because we don't want paint to sink into those as we go ahead. But of course, I don't want to cover all this pattern up. I've just worked really hard. So I'm going to use some clear gesso and some white. I've put some white gesso here. This is going to be where my writing's going to go, so I've just made a little path for some of that writing so it stands out a bit more. Now, oops, let's not put that on its side and pour it everywhere. This is my clear gesso. It doesn't look that different from the white gesso, so do go careful. I'm just going to seal the rest of my papers with the clear, and I can sort of merge the clear with the white to really get a very soft transition, if that's what I want, which it is. If you are concerned that you've put too much white on, you can wipe it off, wipe it back, while it's still wet. This all needs to dry. You can use a hairdryer or a heat tool to aid it on its way. And then we get to do the fun bit, which is the image transfer. While this is finishing drying, we can cut out our lovely little snail. And it's sensible to cut it as close as possible, because when you do an image transfer, you're going to have to rub off lots of the paper. And of course, if you've cut off as much of the white paper as possible, it's going to make that stage a lot easier. I think the chances of these antennae actually transferring may be quite low, but if some of that rubs off, I am not going to panic, and I will just touch it up with a little fine pen, and anything that rubs off I will touch up. If it all rubs off, I possibly will cry while the camera's not running and come up with a plan. No, it'll be fine. The thing with image transfers is that it's not meant to be perfect. I'm going to use my matte gel again as my transfer medium. So what we do is put a good layer of gel where it's going to go. Nice and even, no big splodges. And then just use a piece of old paper to protect. Put a layer on your printout. I have found, and I always find, that a laser print transfers way better than an inkjet. When you've done that, place it wherever you want it to go. Don't go over the back of it if possible, because that will just seal it and make it harder to transfer. So let's stick it down roughly to start with. You want it stuck down all over. Then you need to really press it down. So I use an old store card, starting in the middle and pulling out. You get glue on there, just wipe it off. So middle and out. Nice firm pressure. We're getting all wrinkles and all air bubbles out of the way, so we have 100% contact between our print and the paper underneath. You could use a teaspoon and just burnish it, say any sort of plastic card, or a brayer, little roller, that's another thing to use. And you need to be careful that you do not screw up like I just have there. I have just ripped an antennae off because I was being too firm. So I'm going to stick it. It's really annoying. Don't think I can stick that back. Pretend that I meant to do that. And I will show you how I'm going to touch that up afterwards. Now this needs to dry for probably a couple of hours, or even better, overnight. And before I try and remove the image transfer, I think it'll be worth just taking off the excess of these papers. Best thing to do is do it from the back side, and because I've got torn edges everywhere else, just tearing off the dry paper is pretty straightforward. You could cut this, of course, if you don't like the ripped look. Just fine doing it from the back edge. It's easier, really. Now, my poor little snail, if you remember, I managed to rip off half his head. But when things go wrong, when I'm doing YouTube films like this, I think that's actually quite good, because you can see it's life, it's real. And if something goes wrong when you're on your own, you might panic, but you shouldn't. So all I did was spray a bit of clean water over the back, and you can see immediately how the pattern shows through. And now we have to very gently, in a little circular motion, rub the paper off. And slowly our little snail will appear. It's really important that you are gentle. because there's always the outside possibility the whole thing will lift up, a bit like his antennae went walkies, so we don't want the rest to. You may be thinking to yourself, wouldn't it just be easier to cut it out and collage it on? Absolutely, you could if you want. It's just the nice thing about doing it this way is if you've got colour underneath, which I haven't got particularly strong colour underneath, but if you had strong colour underneath, it will show through. So if I'd left that green line there really bright, it would show through. Whereas in a collage, of course, it never would. So that's taken off the first layer of the paper. As it dries, you will see it will become more and more cloudy because there's actually still a thin layer on there of paper. Gently wet again, or again just with a brush, your finger, and now try and rub that little film off. This is the danger point, because if you rub too hard, the whole thing could come. But just really use your sense of touch. The moment you start to see that you're lifting print, stop. Do pay attention to the edges, because you don't want to have a go at image transfer like this and you're happy with drawing. Just draw the snail on. If you want to collage it on. If you hate snails, choose something else. I just think it's such an interesting technique. When you've removed as much paper as you think you can, I would dry it, because then any remaining paper becomes really obvious. I have to stop now because look, I'm just starting to pick up the very base layer and I don't want to damage that. So if you've lost any crucial bits, let it dry, make sure all that paper's out of the way, and then you could use just a little fine liner. So this is a waterproof black pen, and we could gently touch up the lost bits. So let's give the poor thing 2 suckers out of its eyes. Try and keep my lines and marks in keeping with the rest of the illustrations, so sort of breaking it, and I'm looking at how that's going. It's got to come round here, something like that. Let's give it a little eye there. And you might be thinking, yeah, but it's still quite cloudy. Well, I will show you what we can do there. So the thing to do is to put yet more matte gel on top, just a thin layer. Make sure your pen's dry before you do this. It will protect it in case you fancy doing anything further on top. And secondly, it makes that little thin film of paper slightly more transparent. I'm going to get the writing in now that I want to put in here, only because I do want to put texture, but if I put texture, doing writing over the top of it is going to be tricky. I keep referring back to my little practice piece to see what I did like and didn't. So I am going to just indicate here. I'm going to do all things bright, and I'm going to put beautiful here. And the reason I've decided to do that was so many people don't like snails and things, creatures like that, so I wanted the beautiful here to say it is beautiful. I'm going to do handwriting using some gouache, and I found some tangerine gouache because this was all about that lovely orange colour. I've got a terribly dirty little tray there, but it'll be fine. If you don't want to do handwriting, you could cut it out. You could use little printing blocks. You could do it on the computer and collage it. All sorts of possibilities. I'm using gouache because I want it to be opaque. My only tip I can give you is light pressure on the upstroke, like that, and then heavier pressure on the downstroke like that. If something goes a bit wrong, we can always go in afterwards and just make it look better. Any pencil, so this was just an indication. I'll be able to rub that out in a moment. So once I've got the basics in, I can go back and simply enhance, tidy up any sides and put another layer on. Just using a pencil to go round some of that lettering to make it stand out a bit more. Not sure this is my best idea ever, but it's too late now. Oops. And the next layer I want to do is some stenciling. And I wondered, I've got a lovely leaf stencil, which might be quite fun to go with the snail. Sort of snail shell stencil, but I think that would be too much. Or I can again go back to my test piece and see that it was quite linear, and I could go for something a bit more abstract, like the circles and the lines, which again could pick up the circles of the shell but be a bit more similar, and I could do some that way, some that way, and it also picks up the music, which I quite like. It almost looks like music, and this was all inspired by that hymn. So I have a decision to make. I should do that. Oh, or I could do some texture with this one, and if I feel it needs more, I could do some actual colour stenciling with that one. That sounds like a good idea to me. So I've got modelling paste here, and you're looking for a relatively thick one because then it won't seep under your stencil. Palette knife is useful, but you could use an old credit card. And I need to get some more, don't I? If I'm worried about going over my writing, I can just protect it like this, just a scrap bit of paper, and then I don't have to be too careful. So all you do is use your palette knife and gently scrape through your stencil in the areas you want to go. And then we take that off, and we've got a little bit of texture. It is just a sort of thin smear. So having learnt from over there, I'm going along the lines so that my palette knife doesn't catch under them. This needs to dry, and then we will think about getting colour on, and we'll almost be at the finishing touches, I think. So let's add some colour, and this is where the modelling paste will really come into its own. If you put washes of colour over the top, just adding yet more orange, because this was all meant to be a symphony of orange, like this, it really shows up that gorgeous pattern. If I want to emphasise that pattern even further, I can drop more concentrated colour in the valleys, and that will leave the top of the modelling paste lighter. Those little swatches that I showed you earlier were all about falling in love with orange, but I don't want this to look like, I don't know, bag of tangerines, do I? So I'm going to vary the colours, maybe put in a little bit sort of more burnt sienna. That could be nice. Grey. I'm just using a little set of watercolours, and Pick. Oh, that's quite nice actually. Green and orange is quite fun. What I need to carefully consider is the treatment of the snail itself. Am I going to colour it in? Am I going to leave it black and white? Not sure of the answer at this point. Quite like how I'm just gently extending those stripes using the watercolour. I think that's working pretty well. While it's wet, I've got these which are called woodies. They're water-soluble crayons. They can be used as a pencil, or they can be, say they're water-soluble, can be used as a watercolour, or they can be used as a crayon. And I think it's quite fun to put them through a wet wash, because you get a far richer colour than if you use them on dry paper. And what you can also do is just wash some of those marks out. So say you put one down, even, oh no, that's too much. Just add water and you can fade it down or spread it, activate that. So they're very versatile and they just feel gorgeous in your hands. You can't do a tight sort of frizzy little mark because they're so chunky. I've got these little metallic watercolour paints from Viviva. Yeah, I'm wondering about a coppery shell and a sort of green sluggy body. I don't want to paint the whole thing because I went to a lot of effort to do that transfer, but I just thought a little bit of colour might be fun. And we're sort of getting to the finishing touches really now. Finishing touches are as much or as little as you want. We talked earlier about maybe stenciling in some leaves or something. I want them to be fairly unobtrusive, just kind of there. So I'm going to use watercolour. Because I've decided to use watercolour, I've actually got a sponge that I have wrung out so it is just damp. Because the problem with watercolour and stencils is that it seeps under and you don't get a nice mark. So I'm just using that sponge with fairly strong watercolour on it, dabbing up and down in the hope that this is not going to go under my stencil. That's not too shabby. So I'm going to think carefully about my placement. Give our snail some leaves to eat. Put a few tiny spots of white. I'm going to put a few into some of the lettering and maybe just a couple of tiny sort of circles. Only because if you look at pretty much all my journals, they've all got dots on. It's sort of my signature on a journal. Got some white gouache here. Mix it so it is workable. You could use white ink. If you've got a Posca pen, you could use one of those. Few little white dots, I hope. The big question is, are we finished? A little more black on my snail because he is the star of the show. It's the next day now and everything obviously is super duper dry. When I started doing this journal page, I said to myself, Liz, less is more. Come on, just keep it calm. And I could totally stop there. But of course I've come into the studio with my fresh eyes and fresh enthusiasm, and I thought, no, I want to show some more techniques. So it's always a good idea to rest your eyes. But the two things that I thought would be great fun are a little bit of stamping. Just stamp a couple, like a little ant here and a hidden bug there. And then I found this napkin. So with napkins, take off the back bit so you're just left with that transparent, and it's the perfect colours. If you want to cut out one piece, and let's think, I mean, it's probably one of these red and orange flowers and one of these orangey flowers, maybe that one. If I just tried to rip it, it would be really quite tricky, and if you cut it you get a hard edge, because I'm wanting this all to disappear in. So the secret, and it's not actually very secret at all, is just to use a bit of clean water round the bit you want to get out, and that little path of water gives a path for your rip. So you get a lovely soft edge to it that will just disappear into your collage, because this bit of napkin is quite transparent. I'm thinking of maybe this one here. We just grab a little bit of our matte gel. Be very mindful of what you've got on underneath, because some of that might be water soluble. And then I go on top with more matte gel, and I can push that down amongst round that sort of textured piece there, and all those edges just disappear, and I get some nice transparency as well. Make sure. And can you see how the edge of our snail just shows through? Marvellous. So that's another little technique you can use. Now I've got, it is pigment ink, it's black pigment ink. A lot of ink pads are dye based. It wouldn't matter at this point, because this, I promise, is the final thing I'm doing. But say I wanted to do some stamping and changed my mind and did something else on top, dye-based often will run and smear, and smeared ink looks horrible. I'm going to go for an ant. We all love ladybirds, and I quite like the fact this is a snail that a lot of people don't like snails, and they don't like ants and flies, but I think a lot of people are funny about beetles. I'm going to have a beetle. I haven't used these sort of little rubbery silicone stamps. They're brilliant. You can put them on an acrylic block and it just naturally sticks, and then you can use that as a stamp. Or if you haven't got a block, don't worry, you can just stamp it, but you're likely to get a bit inky. I will put Of course, if you haven't got a stamp like that, you could just use one of those fine liners that I touched up his antennae with and just doodle one. If you've got a larger stamp, sometimes it's actually easier to sort of put the ink pad onto the stamp rather than trying to do that. Just get some more sort of abstract lines. And there's our finished spread. And I hope that is a celebration of all the creepy crawlies that are going through the undergrowth. So just to remind you, we started with collage and we arranged it and we stuck it down using matte medium and let that dry, and then used some gesso to seal the bits we were happy with, some white gesso to prepare a little area so that we could do our image transfer. And we did that image transfer and we didn't panic when I ripped off one of his antennae. Managed to, when it was dry, just draw that back in, and you'd never know, would you? So we did that image transfer, and then we just had a whole pile of fun with some text texture and colour and a bit of writing and a few finishing touches, whether it was a bit more stenciling with the gouache or with the watercolour. Oh yeah, and some final collage with the transparent napkins. Yep, we threw a lot at those pages, and I'm really happy with how it's turned out, and I'm really happy with that little celebration of my slurpy snail. So I hope you can use those techniques, and I hope you had fun.